Hello film friends and welcome back. This is Stacia and welcome to part 2 of my Marilyn Monroe video. Last week we focused on Marilyn's early career up until her breakthrough year of 1953. In this video we'll be focusing on her superstar years up until her untimely death. And like before, this video is going to be about her films and film career instead of focusing on her tragic story and background and her image. I think that gets far too much conversation and her actual film career doesn't get enough. So please sit back, relax, and join me. We left off with her breakthrough year of 1953, and now we'll continue on to the rest of her career, her superstar years, up until her unfortunate, untimely death. After 1953, she's cemented herself as one of the biggest stars in the world. She kicked off 1954 with the movie River of No Return. This movie co-starred Robert Mitchum. It was directed by Otto Preminger. Both Marilyn Monroe and Otto Preminger were kind of forced to do River of No Return. They both thought it was a terrible script, but because of contractual obligations, they had to do it. However, the film was a huge box office hit upon its release and is still considered a popular classic Western. Marilyn Monroe was still accompanied by her acting coach, Natasha Lattès, on the movie set, and this was a point of contention between her and Otto Preminger. A lot of times, Lattès would give Marilyn opposite direction than Preminger wanted, and so he felt like she was undermining his authority. She would tell Marilyn to enunciate and speak real slowly, and he didn't want any of that. He was so frustrated with this that he called Stu Rubin in Los Angeles to get Lattès removed from the set. And the producer did comply with this demand. It upset Marilyn. So Marilyn called Darryl F. Zanuck, and she was the big box office draw. So he relented and had Natasha Lattès return to the set to make Marilyn happy. Preminger was angered by this decision and kind of took it out on Marilyn Monroe on the set of the movie. Marilyn Monroe claimed this was the worst movie she ever made. She called it a Z-grade cowboy film where the scenery and the cinemascope process took precedence over the acting or the script. Otto Preminger was very disparaging for years in the press about working with Marilyn Monroe. Otto Preminger did do an interview in 1980 where he relented in his criticism of Marilyn, saying that she tried real hard, and when somebody tries real hard, you can't be mad at them. And then again, the only reason why the movie was a hit was probably because Marilyn Monroe was in it. The next movie that Marilyn Monroe did was in 1954. She did the movie There's No Business Like Show Business that was directed by Walter Lange. And it co-starred Donald O'Connor and Ethel Merman. It is based on a stage play. And Marilyn Monroe basically did this movie because she was promised the lead in the movie The 7-Year Itch if she relented and did this movie, and she really wanted to do the movie The 7-Year Itch with Billy Wilder. This movie was originally didn't have her part in it. Like I said, they rewrote it to put Marilyn in it to ensure box office success. So the character of Vicky was written specifically for Marilyn Monroe, and she was given the song Heat Wave, which was originally sung by Ethel Merman in the stage play, and it was given to Marilyn Monroe to sing in the movie. Marilyn Monroe actually demanded and got an increase in pay for this movie because she was still under her original contract with 20th Century Fox, where she was basically an on-demand actress, where she was just paid $500 a week which made oftentimes that Marilyn Monroe was getting paid the least amount of money of anybody who was working on the film. So the rates that she was able to get was to get $3,000 a week for doing this movie, which was in her mind still a considerably large sum of money, but not as large as the other stars were making for making this movie. That brings us to the year 1955, and the one movie that she had come out that year was The 7-Year Itch. Like I said, it was directed by Billy Wilder. It was about Richard Sherman, who is played by Tom Ewell. And basically, it's a story of him sending his family away for the summer so he can work. And in the apartment building, he has a beautiful neighbor, played by Marilyn Monroe, who moves in downstairs from him, and his overactive imagination ends up, in his mind, him getting tempted by his new neighbor. And of course, this is the movie where Marilyn Monroe has the iconic scene where she is dressed in the white halter dress and standing over the subway grate, and her dress flies up. And to highlight the disrespect sometimes that Marilyn got, where they just wanted her to be a sexy bimbo in a movie. Her character didn't even have a name. Her character in The 7-Year Itch, even though this is a movie that she actually wanted to do, was just called The Girl. The 7-Year Itch is one of her biggest hits. And after that, Marilyn actually, after The 7-Year Itch, and when she was having her biggest years in movies, that 53, 54, 55 time frame, she actually took a year off. She moved to New York City to focus on her acting skills. She started studying at the Actors Studio, although she never became an official member at the Actors Studio. Also, she met Lee Strasberg, of course, was director of the Actors Studio at the time, and he became a mentor to her. She focused on her craft with such intensity while studying at the Actors Studio. She ended up gaining the respect and admiration of her fellow students. And Lee Strasberg has been quoted saying that the two greatest acting talents he worked with were Marlon Brando and Marilyn Monroe. Aside from training on her acting, Lee and Paula Strasberg actually focused on helping Marilyn gain confidence, something that she struggled with her whole life, and they wanted to help her believe in herself more. And they actually believed in Marilyn's abilities as an actor, and they encouraged her goals. And Marilyn has stated her relationship with the Strasbergs that for the first time she felt accepted not as a freak, but actually as herself. Marilyn wanted to be accepted as a serious actress, and she was disappointed in the roles that 20th Century Fox was making her take. At this point, Marilyn would do something that kind of became the beginning of the downfall of the studio system. And at this point in Hollywood, the studios were king. Actors, basically, if you didn't sign with the studio, you had no career. Once you signed with the studio, they controlled every aspect of your life, from the movies that you were making to even down to the people and relationships that you would have, people that you would marry, all controlled by the studio. And you had no control or direction of your own career. And they took advantage of this with Marilyn as well, because her contract, like I said, was still the contract of basically a day player with the studio system, where she was still only required to make $500 a week. The Big Five studios also owned the movie theaters where the movies would be exhibited at this point, so you really had no recourse except to work for them. This made it not their priority to necessarily make high art or critically acclaimed movies. Their only focus was making a buck to feed their system that they not only made the movies, but controlled where the movies were shown. And so every step of the movie making process was a moneymaker for them. And Marilyn Monroe was the biggest star at the time. You really never dared to defy a studio mogul because they would make or break your career. But in 1955, that is exactly what Marilyn Monroe decided to do. And this ended up rattling the studio system to its core. Like I said, she was 27 at the time. She was the biggest star on the planet. And she was still under that original day player contract. So they not only got the biggest box office draw in Marilyn Monroe, but they got her for cheap. And when they gave her raises, it was something like $3,000 a week, which was still very cheap. Darryl Zanuck would often humiliate and harass Marilyn Monroe. He forced her to take those mental roles and he overworked her. Marilyn, for a long time, longed to do more serious roles. She actually wanted to film an adaptation of Émile Zola's novel Nana, and she tried contacting every director that she knew, but none of them would accept the offer because they didn't want to rock the boat or piss off the studio system. And the era of the director as king in Hollywood was 20 years away still at this point. During her year away from the studio, they would send her scripts and she would return the scripts scrolled on top of them with black marker the word trash. She wasn't going to take any of these roles. She was basically putting her foot down, which could have actually ended her career. The contract that she had was pretty ironclad. She was actually sent a telegram by Darryl Zanuck ordering her to report for work, and Marilyn actually ignored it. It was actually a very bold move for her. Days came and went where they expected her on productions and Marilyn never showed. She ignored all of it. She was basically in for a long fight on this. She was going to dig her heels in. She became financially backed by her friend and photographer Milton Green, and with him she founded Marilyn Monroe Productions. She fired her agent and all of her crew that was based in Los Angeles and hired a whole New York crew to help represent her and get her production company off the ground. She became the first woman since Mary Pickford to start her own production company. She was actually sued by the studio and told she would never work in this town again. People from Fox would do interviews stating that a year off the screen and she'll be washed up and we can find a dozen like her. And the studio did try to find a dozen like her. That's when you saw people like Jane Mansfield and Mamie Van Doren pop up, and no disrespect to them, but they were never actually able to fill Marilyn's shoes. So on New Year's Eve 1955, Fox surrendered and all of the lawsuits were thrown out. Her salary was boosted to $100,000 per film and she was given creative control. She had story approval, director approval. She even controlled who the cinematographer was going to be on the movie. She was actually the person that first broke the studio. She actually broke the control of the studio as king in the movie industry. She had won and she had made history while doing it. The Morning Telegraph reported the story with the headline, "Battle with Studio Won by Marilyn. Actress Wins All Demands." Time magazine called her a shrewd businesswoman, and the Los Angeles Mirror called it one of the greatest single triumphs ever won by an actress. She flew back to Hollywood and jumped into doing her first movie under Marilyn Monroe Productions, which was the 1956 movie Bus Stop, and it was directed by Joshua Logan and, of course, starred Marilyn Monroe and Dawn Murray and Hope Lange. This movie is about an innocent rodeo cowboy named Bo who falls in love with a cafe singer named Cherry in Phoenix. She tries to run away to Los Angeles, but he finds her and forces her to board a bus to his home in Montana. When the bus stops at the Grace's Diner, the passengers learn that the road ahead is blocked. But now everyone knows of the kidnapping, but Bo is determined to have Cherry. The critics went wild for Marilyn in this movie. The New York Times wrote, "Hold on to your chairs, everybody, and get ready for a rattling surprise. Marilyn Monroe has finally proved herself in Bus Stop." Arthur Knight of the Sunday Review wrote, "Speaking of artist, we have a very real one right here in our midst. For Miss Monroe has accomplished what is unquestionably the most difficult feat of any film personality. She has submerged herself so completely in a role that one searches in vain for glimpses of the former calendar girl." So by far the best notices of her career. Just weeks after Bus Stop's glowing reviews, Daryl Zanuck actually fled to Europe and abandoned 20th Century Fox. RKO Pictures was weeks away from collapse, and even Paramount teetered on the verge of bankruptcy. By 1957, the majority of American films were independently produced outside of the studio system. Stars like Frank Sinatra and Gary Cooper followed Marilyn's lead, forming their own small companies and buying more cutting-edge scripts. It was undeniable that the multi-million-dollar industry of mediocrity that the studio system was doing in the 50s was finally crumbling, and the Big Five and their tycoons were on the way out at this point, and that was in large part thanks to Marilyn Monroe. After Bus Stop, unfortunately, only one other movie was made by Marilyn Monroe Productions, and it was the 1957 movie The Prince and the Showgirl. Again, it was not an easy production for Marilyn or anybody who worked on it. She was, despite all of her work at the Actors Studio and with the Strasbergs, she was still unsure of her acting skills. This time, her on-screen coach was Paula Strasberg, and Laurence Olivier, who was not only her co-star, but the director of the movie. They had quite a contentious relationship. He was already contracted to do the movie, direct it, and star in it before Marilyn Monroe took over with Marilyn Monroe Productions. She actually bought the rights to the stage play as well, but Olivier's contract stated that he could not be replaced by anybody as director or actor. So despite her having script approval, director approval, and everything, she couldn't actually remove Laurence Olivier from the movie. Laurence Olivier played his role on the stage in the original play, and it was his wife, Vivien Leigh, who played the showgirl on the stage play. But by the time the movie was produced, Leigh, who was 43 at the time, was considered too old to play the showgirl in the movie, and of course Marilyn Monroe, since she owned the rights, was cast, and she was a huge box office draw, so it was a no-brainer to have her play the role. And after the tense production, Olivier actually stated he would never work with Marilyn Monroe again, but he did admit that when he saw the movie up on the big screen, he did enjoy watching her performance. It was always that the production might be a mess, but when you see it up on the screen, she was brilliant. And if you ever watched The Prince and the Showgirl, Marilyn Monroe is actually miles better than Laurence Olivier in this movie. Sadly, Marilyn Monroe only made a few more movies after this. Her production company, Marilyn Monroe Production, actually folded by this point. She had a falling out with Milton Green, but she still did have a contract with 20th Century Fox, which she did have script and director approval still, and she was making more money with her deal at making $100,000 a picture. The next movie that she made was the 1959 movie Some Like It Hot, which is one of her best movies. It holds up today. I recommend you watch it. This, of course, is directed by Billy Wilder, who did direct her in The 7-Year Itch and co-starred Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. Her health kind of got the best of her. She delayed the production and was still only able to make it through a scene by taking several dozen takes, and that frustrated her co-stars and Billy Wilder. She also suffered a miscarriage during production of this movie, which sadly nobody really took sympathy upon her for or tried to help her through. So her delays and absences cost the production actually millions of dollars, and that's all that mattered to the producers of the movie and to Billy Wilder. They actually threw a wrap party. Billy Wilder threw the wrap party and did not invite her, which hurt Marilyn Monroe a lot because she had previously got along with Billy Wilder very well. Jack Lemmon stated years later that she drove Billy Wilder and Tony crazy. She drove me a little crazy too, and it was almost always the same thing, the lateness. Lemmon got along great with Marilyn, in part because he had fewer scenes with her than Tony Curtis did, and he had a lot of sympathy for her. He said she had a lot of problems and was basically an unhappy girl. But like I said, whatever happened during the production, this is one of the greatest comedies of all time. In 1960, she would make the movie Let's Make Love, co-starring Tony Randall, Frankie Vaughan, and Yves Montand. It was directed by George Cukor. Marilyn took this movie only because she owed one more movie to 20th Century Fox, and her contract with them would be over at that point. And she was excited for that relationship to come to an end. She didn't like the script for the movie. Even though she had script approval, she just let that go because she wanted the contract to end so bad. And this was her last musical comedy, her last film in color, her last film in CinemaScope. Charlton Heston said in his autobiography that he was asked to play the character, which was later played by Yves Montand. He refused because of the presence of Marilyn Monroe and her reputed lack of professionalism on movie sets. And the film was not well received and was not one of her biggest hits. At this time, unfortunately, Marilyn Monroe's reputation on set had caught up to her, and I think personally it might be because of the end of her contract with 20th Century Fox. They had no reason to actually back her and even stick up for her a little, because their relationship with her was ending with this movie. And now we've come to the point where Marilyn was making the last movie that she would complete of her career, and that was the 1961 movie The Misfits. This was directed by John Huston, who gave her one of her earliest breaks that really shot her on the trajectory of being a big star with her small part in The Asphalt Jungle, and he actually really liked Marilyn, and co-starred Clark Gable, Montgomery Clift, Thelma Ritter, and Eli Wallach, who Eli Wallach was actually a big fan of Marilyn Monroe. He had worked with her at the Actors Studio, really got to know her, and really respected her as an actress. He was a student of the Actors Studio and of the method himself, saying that she was one of the best actresses he ever worked with in his career. This was not only Marilyn's last film, it was Clark Gable's last film, who he was not in good health at this point. Neither was Montgomery Clift, but he ended up living until 1966, and he made 3 more films after this movie. Because the 3 leads basically of the movie weren't doing that well, there was a full-time doctor on the set to tend to Montgomery Clift, Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable. On the last day of filming, Clark Gable said regarding Marilyn Monroe, "Christ, I'm glad this picture is finished. She damn near gave me a heart attack." And the following day, Clark Gable suffered a severe coronary thrombosis, and he died 10 days later at the age of 59. According to writer Arthur Miller, Clark Gable had already seen a rough cut of the movie by the last day of filming and actually said, "This is the best picture I've made and the only time I've ever been able to act." Marilyn was going through a lot of things in her personal life during the filming of this movie. It was actually nearing the end of her marriage to Arthur Miller, who wrote this for her. But they were struggling in their marriage. They had a couple of miscarriages. He was on the set all the time because he was the screenwriter. And of course, Arthur Miller is a well-regarded, world-renowned playwright. She found some of the writings for her character in the movie, even though he wrote this for her to get that serious acting part that she wanted. He wrote this for her, but she found her character cruel, as Miller had based some of the harder parts of the movie on Marilyn's actual life. And some of the writing, if you ever watch this movie, is kind of cruel to her character. And Miller started an affair with on-set photographer Inga Morath, who became his third and final wife. They were married for decades. The Misfits is one of her best movies. She's very good in it, but it is heartbreaking to watch. Sadly, a year and a half after the movie The Misfits came out, Marilyn would pass away through a drug overdose, whether that was self-inflicted or accidental. But of course, her image lives on forever, and her movies live on forever. She was actually filming one more movie at the time of her death, which is called Something's Gotta Give, and you can actually find a short version of the movie because the movie was never completed because of her death. It's just over about 30 minutes long, but you can find that, and what they have cobbled together is not a coherent story, but it yet again highlights Marilyn's skill as a comedic actress, which was her strong point, and she should have never been ashamed of that. She is one of the best comedic actresses of her time. So I hope you enjoyed this look at the career of Marilyn Monroe. I hope it inspired you to actually check out some of her movies if you never have, and just see her as this image of Marilyn Monroe. It'd be great if people focused more on her movie career instead of always focusing on her personal life, because you can focus on that a little bit, but I think we got away from focusing on any of her movie career, and it is really worth looking at. So like I said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please join me next time. Bye.